Kathmandu, Nepal, July 24, 2024. A regional jet lifts off from Tribhuvan International Airport and stalls 13 seconds later. 18 dead, 1 survivor. The airline had purchased flight data monitoring software specifically designed to detect dangerous takeoff patterns. It had never been used. In the 16 months before this accident, the same aircraft had recorded 14 takeoffs with rotation rates well above the safe limit. 2 of the worst were flown by the captain of this flight. The data was there. Every flight had been recorded. Nobody had looked at it. The man responsible for making sure that data was reviewed, the person whose job title required him to know about every safety violation in the airline, was the captain. He was also the airline's director of operations. On the morning of this accident, he boarded an aircraft carrying 17 illegal passengers, unsecured hazardous materials, and a V-speed card that had contained a critical error for nearly 10 years. He did not protest. He pushed the throttles forward. What happens when the only person with the authority to stop a flight is the one flying it? Here is what that looks like from the beginning. A small Nepalese airline, barely solvent, operating in one of the most under-regulated aviation environments in the world. A ferry flight that violated nearly every rule governing such operations. Passenger limits, cargo procedures, hazardous materials handling, pre-flight checks. A V-speed card wrong since the day the airline was founded. A flight data recorder capturing dangerous patterns on every flight that nobody ever analyzed. And a captain who, as director of operations, had the authority and the obligation to stop all of it, boarding the aircraft anyway, taking the left seat, and rotating the nose at more than twice the recommended rate. 13 seconds. That was how long the flight lasted. This is the Surya Airlines accident. To understand how a flight like this was possible, you need to understand the environment it operated in. Nepal is one of the most geographically challenging places in the world to fly. The Himalayan terrain dominates the country. Weather can be severe and unpredictable, and many airports are located in valleys or on hillsides that demand exceptional precision from their crews. Flying in Nepal is genuinely difficult, and the country's aviation industry has grown substantially to serve both its domestic population and its large and growing tourism sector. What has not grown at the same pace is the regulatory infrastructure meant to oversee that industry, and the gap has been visible and consequential for years. Nepal is classified by the United Nations as a least developed country, and its Civil Aviation Authority, the CAA, is chronically underfunded and understaffed. But unlike most countries at Nepal's economic level, the aviation industry here is large and operationally complex. The gap between the industry's scale and the regulator's capacity to oversee it has been visible for years and has never been adequately closed. The structural problems go deeper than funding. Nepal has placed its Civil Aviation Authority within the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, not the Ministry of Infrastructure or Transportation, where aviation regulators typically sit. Local reporting has documented close financial ties between CAA officials and the tourism industry the authority is nominally overseeing. The International Civil Aviation Organization has repeatedly urged Nepal to restructure this arrangement. As of the date of this accident, that restructuring had not occurred. The consequences have been consistent and well documented. Every Nepalese airline has been blacklisted by the European Aviation Safety Agency for years. A compliance audit conducted in 2023, the year before this accident, found that Nepal's oversight capability was not improving. It was getting worse. Surya Airlines operated within this environment and was, by the standards of that environment, unremarkable. One small airline among several operating with minimal scrutiny and chronic financial instability. The airline had launched in 2014 with a single Bombardier CRJ-200 regional jet, intending to connect Kathmandu with a handful of domestic destinations. Those ambitions quickly exceeded the airline's financial reality. Routes were canceled. Expansion plans collapsed. Between 2018 and 2020, the airline suspended operations entirely on multiple occasions, once for over 3 months, due to lack of funds, each time resuming when finances allowed. COVID grounded it again through most of 2020. By the time operations resumed, the fleet had shrunk to 2 active CRJ-200s, with a third sitting in long-term storage. At the center of this story was one of those two aircraft, registration 9NAME, built in 2003, 20 years old at the time of this flight. In March of 2024, its certificate of airworthiness came up for renewal. The main landing gear required an overhaul. That overhaul could not be completed on time, so the airline applied for and received an extension, allowing continued operations until June 19th. When that date passed without the overhaul complete, the aircraft was grounded. Engineers eventually finished the work on July 22nd. The aircraft then needed a C-check, a deep maintenance inspection, which the airline's maintenance facility in Pokhara was equipped to perform. On the morning of July 24th, 2024, 9NAME was cleared for a ferry flight from Kathmandu to Pokhara to begin that C-check. A return to service check had been completed earlier that morning. The paperwork was in order. The captain assigned to the ferry flight was 35 years old, with 6,185 total flight hours, including more than 4,900 on the CRJ-200. He was experienced on the type. He was also Surya Airlines Director of Operations, the senior management figure personally responsible for the airline's day-to-day regulatory compliance, its safety systems, and the conduct of its flight operations. His first officer was 26, with 1,824 total hours and approximately 1,600 on the CRJ. He had failed his initial type rating simulator check in Germany in 2019 and required 3 additional months of remedial training before passing. Surya Airlines had deducted the cost of that extra training from his salary. He had also been furloughed without pay during the COVID period. At the time of this flight, he was still repaying a loan taken out to cover living expenses during his extended training stay. His colleagues described him as enthusiastic and well-liked. He had told people close to him that he was dissatisfied with his compensation and the financial pressure he was carrying. Somewhere in the maintenance records and performance documentation for 9N-AME, a V-speed reference card was stored. V-speeds, the critical velocities calculated before every takeoff, are derived from the aircraft's weight, temperature, runway elevation, and flap setting, and they define the boundaries within which a safe takeoff can be executed. Airlines typically compile these values into printed reference cards organized by takeoff weight. When Surya Airlines created its V-speed cards, presumably around the time of the airline's founding in 2014, someone had copied the values from the 17,500 kilogram card directly onto the 18,500 kilogram card, without updating the numbers. A heavier aircraft requires higher speeds to achieve safe flight. The card for 18,500 kilograms was therefore several knots too slow across all 3 V-speeds. That error had been sitting in the documentation for approximately 10 years. No quality assurance process had ever caught it. No pilot had ever flagged it. Every flight that had used that card had taken off with margins slightly smaller than the crew believed, unaware, every time, that the numbers they were trusting were wrong. To understand what happened on the runway at Tribhuvan Airport on the morning of July 24th, you need to understand 2 things: what correct rotation technique looks like and why it matters, and what the flight data from Surya Airlines' own aircraft had been showing for over a year before this flight. When a pilot begins a takeoff rotation, pulling back on the controls to raise the nose, the aircraft does not respond instantaneously. A sequence of events unfolds in a specific order. The elevators deflect, the nose rises, the angle of attack increases. Only then does the flight path begin to angle upward. The key relationship is this: angle of attack equals pitch angle minus flight path angle. During a normal rotation, the flight path begins responding before the pitch reaches its final value, which keeps the angle of attack within safe limits throughout. If the pilot rotates too quickly, the pitch angle rises faster than the flight path can follow. The angle of attack climbs toward the critical threshold, the point where airflow separates from the upper wing surface and lift collapses, before the aircraft has built enough speed and momentum to climb safely. Close to the ground, where the aerodynamic phenomenon known as ground effect further reduces the stall margin, this risk is amplified. A standard rotation rate of around 3 degrees per second is defined specifically to keep the angle of attack within safe limits while the flight path responds. Exceeding that rate, significantly, repeatedly, is a pattern that should trigger intervention. Surya Airlines had purchased flight data monitoring software to identify exactly this kind of pattern, well in advance of this accident. The software was designed to ingest the flight data recorder outputs from every flight and flag exceedances automatically. Rotation rates, pitch attitudes, airspeed deviations, anything outside defined parameters. It would have produced reports. It would have generated alerts. It would have put names to the pilots whose technique was drifting outside safe limits. It had never been activated. Investigators examining the flight data records from Surya Airlines' 2 operational CRJ-200s going back 16 months found exactly what the software would have found, had anyone run it. 14 takeoffs with peak rotation rates above 5 degrees per second, well beyond the 3-degree standard. 2 of the most severe events had occurred on 9NAME itself, a rotation rate of 5.8 degrees per second on January 11, 2024, and 5.5 degrees per second on March 19, 2024. Both had been flown by the captain now assigned to the July 24th ferry flight. He was not the only pilot with this pattern. The problem was fleet-wide, suggesting a systemic training deficiency rather than an individual aberration. The Flight Operations Manual explicitly warned of the stall risk associated with over-rotation. The airline's safety management system, which existed on paper, was designed to collect and analyze exactly this kind of data. There was no functioning safety reporting chain. There was no flight data analysis program in practice. There was no accountability mechanism for the pattern the data had been quietly recording. The Director of Operations, whose role required oversight of all of this, had himself contributed 2 of the worst incidents on record. On the morning of the flight, the first officer arrived in the cockpit before the captain and began calculating the takeoff V speeds alone. The aircraft's weight had been estimated at 18,137 kilograms by dispatchers, a reasonable figure given that the passengers had not checked in through normal channels and their baggage had not been weighed. The first officer rounded up to the nearest 500-kilogram card interval, as procedure required, and selected the 18,500-kilogram card. He calculated V1 at 114 knots, VR at 118 knots, and V2 at 125 knots. The correct values, accounting for actual conditions and the aircraft's true weight, should have been 117, 122, and 127. The difference was small, 3 to 4 knots across the board. The card was wrong. He had no way of knowing, and no mechanism existed to tell him. When the captain boarded at 10:40 a.m., he asked the first officer what checks had been completed, then spent time talking with other staff members about the C-check and unrelated topics. He did not cross-check the V-speed calculations, a required step under standard operating procedures. Even if he had, a cross-check against the same incorrect card would not have caught the error. While this was happening, outside the aircraft, Surya Airlines was assembling a manifest that no legitimate ferry flight should have carried. 17 people beyond the required crew of 2 boarded the aircraft. A third pilot, several mechanics, the manager of continuing airworthiness, the maintenance manager, the safety manager, the quality assurance manager, and other staff. One employee brought his wife and 4-year-old child. No safety briefing was given. No flight attendants were present. Into the cargo hold, and then into the passenger cabin itself, maintenance staff loaded tools, equipment, wheel chocks, and food. And then, when the hold was full, containers of hydraulic fluid, engine oil, and flammable cleaning fluids placed directly onto passenger seats. None of it was secured. None of it was declared. The airline had no authorization to carry hazardous materials. The captain, as Director of Operations, was present for all of it. He said absolutely nothing. Some pre-flight control checks were skipped, notable given that the aircraft had been out of service for over a month, and that control system issues are most likely to surface after extended ground periods. At 11:02 a.m., the last passenger boarded. The engine started, the left requiring a second attempt after an initial failure. At 11:10 and 25 seconds, the captain pushed the throttles forward for takeoff. In the cabin behind him, 17 people who should not have been on this flight sat among unsecured cargo and containers of flammable fluid, with no briefing and no crew to assist them. Many of them were the airline's own safety and management staff. the people whose professional roles existed specifically to prevent this kind of operation. 11:10 a.m. The CRJ-200 accelerates down runway 02 at Tribhuvan International. The first officer is monitoring carefully. At 114 knots, he calls V1. At 118 knots, he calls rotate. At 120 knots, 2 knots above the already low calculated rotation speed, and still several knots below where the correct card would have placed it, the captain pulls back. He pulls hard and fast. Within 1 second, the elevators deflect from 1 degree to 10 degrees, nose up. The aircraft pitches at a peak rate of 6.5 degrees per second, more than twice the standard, the most aggressive rotation ever recorded across Surya Airlines' entire fleet. In 2 seconds, the pitch angle exceeds 12 degrees. The flight path cannot keep up. The angle of attack climbs rapidly, accelerated both by the excessive pitch rate and by the slightly low rotation speed that required a higher angle of attack to generate lift. In ground effect, the stall threshold is lower than in free air. The right wing, which on this aircraft carried a slightly higher angle of attack than the left due to a persistent asymmetry, reaches that threshold first. The stick shaker fires on the right side. 1 second later, it fires on the left as well. The aircraft is a few feet off the ground, still airborne. The first officer reacts immediately. He shouts, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, sir, sir, sir." It is the sound of alarm without instruction, the startled response of a pilot who recognizes catastrophe but cannot yet convert that recognition into the command that might stop it. Reduce pitch, push forward, firewall the thrust. Those words require a fraction more time than the situation allows. The first officer needed to say them. He had not yet found them. The correct response to the stick shaker is immediate. Apply maximum thrust. Push the nose forward slightly to reduce the angle of attack. Prevent the stall from developing. The captain does not do this. Whether he is startled, whether the ground proximity prevents him from pushing forward, whether the sequence simply unfolds faster than his trained responses can follow, the investigation cannot fully determine. What the flight data shows is that no recovery input is made. The aircraft lifts off in a partial stall and immediately begins rolling right. The right wing, deeper into the stall, generates less lift. The bank reaches 25 degrees before the captain applies left control input. As the left wing begins to stall in response, the roll reverses rapidly, too rapidly, reaching 55 degrees in the opposite direction before the aircraft rights itself momentarily. Through all of this, the aircraft is still climbing rapidly. The stick shaker is continuous. Ground proximity warnings are sounding. The aircraft reaches approximately 100 feet. Then it fully stalls. The CRJ-200 is fitted with a stick pusher, an automated system that applies nose-down elevator input to prevent deep stall, a condition particularly dangerous in T-tailed aircraft, where a fully stalled wing can blanket the horizontal stabilizer and eliminate pitch control entirely. The stick pusher activates. The captain overrides it, pulling back hard against the automation in a last attempt to avoid the ground. At 100 feet, with the aircraft at 94 degrees of bank, past vertical, essentially inverted, there is nothing left to be done. The right wingtip strikes the taxiway to the right of the runway. The fuel tank ruptures and ignites. The fuselage continues forward across the grass, partially inverted, and strikes a shipping container, a storage shed, and a helicopter parked within the runway safety area. The cockpit section shears away from the cabin on impact with the shipping container and falls into a ravine on the far side. The cabin continues forward and downward into a construction site 21 meters below runway level. The impact forces are catastrophic. The spilled fuel from the ruptured wing tanks reaches the cabin interior, where the unsecured containers of hydraulic fluid, engine oil, and flammable cleaning materials have scattered across the floor and seats. The fire that follows is fast and total. None of the 16 people in the cabin survive. In the separated cockpit section, the shipping container has absorbed some of the impact. The fire is less intense here, at least initially. Airport ground staff, not the fire crews, who cannot reach the site, run to the wreckage and pull the captain out. He is taken to hospital with serious injuries. He is the only person recovered alive. The safety manager, the maintenance manager, the quality assurance manager, the people whose professional purpose was to prevent operations exactly like this one, are found in the wreckage of the cabin. So is the child. The investigation was conducted by Nepal's Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were both recovered and provided a clear technical picture of the final seconds. The immediate cause was unambiguous: an excessive rotation rate at a marginally low airspeed, producing a stall and ground effect with no time or altitude to recover. The captain had pulled at 6.5 degrees per second, the worst rotation ever recorded on the airline's fleet, and the aircraft had responded exactly as physics required. What the investigation examined more carefully was why this had been possible, not just on this flight, but at all. The V-speed card error had been present since approximately the airline's founding in 2014. A copy-paste mistake, the values from the 17,500 kilogram card reproduced without change onto the 18,500 kilogram card, had reduced the calculated rotation speed by 4 knots for every flight conducted at that weight in the 10 years since. Each of those flights had taken off with margins slightly smaller than the crew believed. None had crashed, because 4 knots of margin erosion is not by itself fatal, but margins are cumulative. When the wrong V-speed combined with an excessive rotation rate and an asymmetric stall tendency, what had been survivable in isolation became unsurvivable together. The flight data monitoring system sat unused in the airline's records. Investigators ran it themselves on the 16 months of archived data. The output was immediate and unambiguous: 14 over-rotation events, 2 of them involving this captain, all of them above the threshold that should have triggered retraining or removal from line operations. The pattern had been there, fully documented, on every flight, waiting to be read. The software had been purchased to find it. Nobody had turned it on. The director of operations, the captain, was the person whose role required him to oversee the safety management system, ensure the flight data analysis program was operational, and act on the findings it produced. He had instead contributed 2 of the events the software would have flagged, and had done so without any consequence, correction, or review. The investigation found no evidence that anyone at any level of the airline had reviewed flight data trends, conducted safety audits, or maintained a functioning safety reporting chain. The ferry flight itself had violated regulations governing passenger carriage, cargo loading, hazardous materials transport, and crew complement, comprehensively and without concealment. The investigation noted that violations of this magnitude do not occur spontaneously. They reflect a culture in which non-compliance has become normalized to the point that nobody considers the consequences. An airline operating in an environment of genuine regulatory oversight would not have been able to sustain that culture. Surya had been operating in an environment where the regulator lacked the capacity, the independence, and in some cases, the motivation to look closely. The 4-year-old child who had been brought aboard by a staff member was among those who did not survive. His mother, seated beside him in a cabin with no flight attendants and no safety briefing of any kind, did not survive either. In the immediate aftermath, Surya Airlines voluntarily ceased operations. With 9 NAME destroyed and its second aircraft grounded, the airline had no flyable fleet. 5 of its 10 management-level staff had been on the aircraft. 4, the maintenance manager, the manager of continuing airworthiness, the safety manager, and the quality assurance manager, were killed. The airline's website still lists them in their roles. The Civil Aviation Authority of Nepal revoked Surya Airlines' Air Operator Certificate. At the time of this recording, the airline is seeking recertification. The specific failures identified by the investigation each point toward remedies that are well understood and widely implemented elsewhere in the world. Flight data monitoring programs, functional ones, not purchased software sitting unused, are standard practice at every airline operating under serious regulatory oversight. The principle is simple. The data is already being recorded on every flight. Reading it costs almost nothing relative to what it prevents. Identifying a captain with 2 severe over-rotation events in 3 months and providing corrective training costs a fraction of what a fatal accident costs in every dimension. The tool existed. The practice of using it did not. V-Speed Card Quality Assurance is similarly straightforward and inexpensive to implement. Cross-checking reference cards against each other and against manufacturer data at regular intervals is a basic quality control function. A 10-year-old copy-paste error that erodes takeoff margins on every flight at a given weight is exactly the kind of defect that a functioning quality assurance process exists to find. The broader structural problem, the one the investigation named as the true root cause, is harder to fix with a single mandate. Nepal's regulatory environment has been documented as inadequate for years. The EASA blacklist, the ICAO recommendations, the 2023 audit finding that oversight was deteriorating. None of it had produced structural change before this accident. Whether it produces change after is a question that cannot yet be answered. What the Surya accident illustrates with unusual clarity is the relationship between oversight and culture. Safety culture inside an airline does not develop independently of the regulatory environment outside it. When an airline knows that nobody is watching, or that the people watching have reasons not to act, the internal mechanisms that are supposed to catch errors, flag patterns, and enforce procedures tend to atrophy. Not through any single decision, but through the accumulated weight of violations that go unremarked, patterns that go unaddressed, and a director of operations who can board an aircraft carrying a 4-year-old child in an unsecured cabin and push the throttles forward without anyone stopping him. The flight data was running. The software existed. The authority to act was in the left seat. None of it was used. If you want to understand what aviation safety actually requires, not just the tools and the procedures, but the environment in which they are actually applied, stay with this channel. The next one is already waiting.